Thanks a lot for that, Robin. So I want to turn our attention to cities for the next 10 minutes or so, and particularly our city. And I guess the thing that I'm most interested in is the question of a few aspects of globalisation and how our city is wrapped up in that story. And the thing I'm most interested in is the role of multinational corporations and how are multinational corporations organised in and around cities, and particularly how is Perth engaging with the strategies or otherwise of multinational corporations. So the study of corporate power, or the geography of corporate power, has been a long fascination for a range of social sciences. And typically the map up here on the left, an old map taken from the United States in the 1920s, went about looking at corporations by simply doing counts of how many corporate headquarters were in different cities and trying to draw conclusions from that about the economic power that those particular cities had. So in the United States, for example, it's no surprise that up in the northeast, New York, Chicago and so on, stand out in the 1920s as being the key centres of corporate power. No surprises around that, given their industrial history, where you saw the co-location of management, of production, of logistics and so on. But of course the world became more complicated as the 20th century unfolded, and there was a greater appreciation amongst social scientists that simply going and counting things didn't tell us all that much. In fact, what we needed to know a lot more about was the relationships between different types of cities and between firms. So beginning to look at spatial interdependence, if you like, and the relationships between different localities. So by the 1990s, up on the far right there, we're starting to think about the notion of a world cities network. And this was based partly on the sort of count data on where corporate headquarters were located, but also flows of information, flows of people, trade data, and so fairly standard sort of measures of interactions between places. And it certainly gave us a little bit of the picture of what might be going on. But I guess what it tended to do was to focus on a particular geometry, if you like, of world city power. And that tended to concentrate power around the usual suspects, I guess, of London, Tokyo, New York, Chicago to some degree, and Paris and a few other cities. And the rest of the world was largely sort of some other piece of economic periphery that was largely unimportant. Australia didn't figure particularly prominently in any of these studies. It's hardly surprising. Corporate influence was fairly moderate here. The number of large corporations that emerged was fairly small. And it wasn't really until probably about 15 or 18 years ago that some much more sophisticated techniques emerged to try and understand how corporations were operating across the world in a way that was a little bit more sophisticated than just counting up the number of headquarters in places. The problem, of course, with just counting up the number of headquarters in a place is that it tells us nothing about branch offices, it tells us nothing about the geopolitical landscape, it tells us nothing about the regulatory environment, it tells us nothing about the underlying socio-cultural landscape and so on. The work that's been undertaken over the past 18 years or so has tried to rectify this by looking much more closely at the nature of the network. And in particular, what these studies have tried to do is to understand the ways in which different firms have complex reporting relationships across time and across space. So essentially what these studies do is they look at not just corporate headquarters, but all of the branch offices associated with large corporations, where they're located, and how those branch offices report to each other. So we might find, for example, that a company has a branch office here in Perth, it reports on to Singapore, that office then in turn reports to New York, and so all of a sudden we begin to get a sense of what that network looks like. So the map at the bottom begins to show you the sort of complexity that these studies that emerged during the last 20 years began to highlight. They still tended to point towards corporate power being concentrated amongst those big three, New York, Tokyo and London. But other parts of the world began to be recognised as being important. I think one of the criticisms I have of some of this work is that it also fell into the trap of simply getting into categorisation of places. So the work up here at the top is basically categorising cities by broad regions, so the Americas here on the left, In the centre, Europe, and over to the right, Asia. And you can see the orange dots are the alpha cities, so the most important. The beta cities are the kind of the next tier down, and then we finish off with the gamma cities. And you can see Sydney and Melbourne just kind of make a mention in there. No mention of, perhaps not surprisingly, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, Hobart, Darwin, any other centre. So those studies were simply used early on to categorise. More recently, the studies, though, which are shown on the right, I think begin to tell quite an interesting story. So the ones over here on the right begin to look at things like regional trading networks or the relationship between particular locations and, in this case, old arrangements around empire. So on the top right there you see a number of Australian cities. PE is Perth, obviously, Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne and Auckland. And you can see that some of the most complex and common reporting relationships amongst firms are with parts of the old British Empire. So over more than a century, there's a degree of inertia in these old corporate relationships that still hang on to this day. It's a more complex picture than that, and I'll come to that in a minute. The other little methodological flaw, though, I think in some of this work is that most of the work is done using advanced producer services. So essentially what they do is they look at the reporting networks and the office locations of large accounting firms, investment houses, legal firms, basically those firms that are in the finance services and related industries. So what that tends to do is it obscures other interesting sort of geometries in the geography, I suppose, of multinational corporations. We know nothing about what these networks look like in the pharmaceuticals industry. We don't know much about what it looks like in the energy resources sector. We don't know much about what it looks like in the mineral resources sector. We only really have this view largely from these advanced producer services type firms. So, of course, that led my team to start to do some work on, well, what does it look like in Australia? And so in uncovering some of the early work that was done on Australia, of course, we found these traditional count-type studies of corporate headquarters. And you can see here a study that was completed in the late 70s, but which mapped the number of corporate headquarters across Australia between 1953 and 1978. One of the little things that is rather interesting about that is the switch that you can see between Melbourne and Sydney. So you can begin to see Melbourne was Australia's corporate powerhouse, really probably up until the early 70s, the late 1960s, and then you see this very clear switch where all of a sudden Sydney becomes Australia's corporate headquarters capital. Perth doesn't really figure. Adelaide's sort of a truck stop on the Nullarbor. It's got not a lot to offer. Brisbane's sort of sitting up there, waiting for its tourist industry to do what it does and so on. But by the time we get to 2013, which is where we come into the picture and go back and map all of this again, we see things have changed a bit. And we map the data across the Australian Stock Exchange by both the number of headquarters and market capitalisation. Now, what is very interesting about this is when you look at market capitalisation, in 2013, Perth surpassed Sydney. So we had more market capitalisation tied up in our ASX firms than Australia's global capital. And that's probably a fact that was lost on a lot of people. Most of it's gone now, of course, but we had it then, and I think we should probably fly the flag at least on this historical data. I refuse to update it until things improve. But in terms of the number of companies we had, it was still relatively small. So we had a lot of capital here for a short period of time, but we had become more significant than Perth, Brisbane and Adelaide. But of course, I'd fallen into the same trap as those earlier studies. I'd gone and counted up the number of headquarters, looked at market capitalisation, looked at the performance of firms in terms of profitability and return on investment and so on. But I hadn't captured the network. I didn't understand how Perth related with lots of other firms. So that was really the next stage in our work. So the next stage in our work was to try and understand for two sectors, the materials sector, effectively mining, and the energy sector, where did Perth fit in the global corporate network? So if you can imagine an Excel spreadsheet with 500 cells in either direction, what we then effectively did was look at every single, we looked at 500 cities, we looked at every reporting relationship for firms in those sectors between those cities. So we had thousands and thousands of data points that we collected to try and map what did the materials network look like and what did the energies network look like. So nobody else had really done this. Everybody had always focused on accounting firms and insurance firms and investment houses and so on. And what we turned up was a really interesting, I think, geometry of global power. We haven't finished this piece of work yet. There's still a long way to go with it, so this is really a first snapshot. So at the top here we have the materials network, and you see Australia plays quite a significant role, and you can see Perth there is fairly significant. The lines show the dominant reporting relationships to North America, to Europe and so on. The colours, don't worry about those for the moment, but you can see there the sorts of cities that are dominating. What it points to is that Europe is still extremely influential in this particular sector. Similarly, North America, that Australia, though, is also well positioned. On the right there, you can see all of those data. So let's just focus on the top table here, and you can see Zurich at the top. You can see Melbourne about sort of 2/3 of the way down, and Perth at the bottom of the list, ranked in at about number 20. This is effectively a measure of the relationship between in-reports and out-reports of officers. So effectively what we did is we looked at every firm that reports to Perth that is located somewhere else, and every firm that reports from Perth to somewhere else. And we find in both energy and materials that more firms report to Perth than report out of Perth. What I think is particularly interesting is the last measure. The last measure, we've given this term betweenness index. Doesn't really mean much. What it really talks about, I suppose, is the notion of, think of the notion of a network of friends. So you have a group of sort of 10 friends, and that group of friends are very important in terms of social support and so on, but one or two of those friends is especially important in making sure that network keeps working. So that's the person who always sends the texts out to say, let's go and have a drink somewhere, or let's meet for coffee and so on. The betweenness index is kind of a measure of the degree to which that person is really important. So if you take that person out of the network begins to lose function, it begins to lose order. So what we see here then is Zurich is particularly important in terms of the materials, the relationship between firms in the materials sector. Similarly, London and so on, but Melbourne and Perth are also particularly important. They play a really crucial point in the relationships between firms across cities. In energy, Perth is the only Australian city that even gets a Guernsey. Quite a different set of cities there, with Moscow at the top. But what effectively it shows is Australian cities are very much wrapped up in this globalisation story, and if we begin to look at different types of sectors other than insurance, financial houses and so on, we end up getting these very, very different networks of power. What we also need to do, though, and we've just started this work, is to understand this in more than just abstract terms. All of these firms touch the ground somewhere. They all have an office in a real place. They have a well, except if you're in Panama, I suppose. But there is an office in a real place somewhere that employs real people, that has real ups and downs in terms of its balance sheet, that has a direct impact on labour markets, that affects the planning strategies and policy strategies of local governments, state governments and so on. So part of what we're starting to do as this project now is to look at those firms that are in Perth for a different range of sectors. Where are they located? And how is that playing out in terms of the local economy, local labour markets, and how are those localities organising themselves to engage with this emerging picture of globalisation? I think the other thing that we need to do some more work on is the regional geometries. So what do I mean by that? Well, what's rather interesting, of course, is that we've got a narrative around engagement with Asia. But of course, our engagement isn't solely with Asia. And what we found, in particular with materials firms and energy firms in Perth, our connections with Africa were equally strong. So when you're sitting in Canberra, maybe an engagement with Asia strategy makes sense. When you're sitting in Perth with our particular configuration of firms, a different type of strategy might make sense. I think the other thing that we need to do some more work on is what is that spatial structure and strategies, what does it mean for local economic development? How do we ensure that our local economic development strategies are aligned in one way or another with the strategies of those firms to maximise potentials for employment generation and so on? And I suppose I couldn't finish tonight by talking about innovation. So the buzzword of the last month or 6 weeks or whatever it's been, seems like much, much longer. What does having these corporate players in your backyard mean for entrepreneurialism, competitiveness, innovation and so on? It's a bit of an unanswered question still at this stage. And on that note, I'll leave it there. Thank you.